it's in the mainstream, is it not, that the British intelligence services did not want the name of the bomber to be leaked, but the Americans managed to leak it. Also, there have got to be some questions about how he was identified so quickly. You know, you'd have thought if somebody blows themselves to pieces like that, it might take quite a while to work out who exactly it was that had blown themselves to pieces. And as I understand it, from the stuff I've been looking at, the suggestion is that he was identified from a credit card that he was carrying. Now, is that a credible idea? I don't know. So perhaps people can make their own minds up about that. But as we know from previous attacks, like the 9/11 attack, where they magically found Mohammed Atta's passport in the rubble, or the attacks in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo attacks, where the Kouachi brothers basically decided that the Kouachi brothers left their passports in the getaway car, thus allowing themselves to be identified and then subsequently killed. And of course, once people are dead, it's very hard to put them on trial and find out what really happened. So in other words, we've got some anomalies in this attack already in terms of how, you know, the information has come out. I think it's fairly clear that the bomb was a fairly sophisticated bomb, which implies that it's not built by amateurs, so that is another indication.
Well, it was certainly an extremely powerful bomb, wasn't it?
Yeah. And the other, of course, the other interesting link is the Libyan link, because the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group have had their cadres based in Manchester for quite a long time, because for many years they were allowing those people to operate from Manchester because they were anti-Gaddafi. So, in other words, a lot of what seems to have happened here has got a lot to do with our precipitate desire to overthrow the Libyan regime a few years ago in 2011, when the French and British governments in particular took the lead in deciding to they said they needed a no-fly zone to stop an aerial-based massacre in Benghazi. Not that there was any evidence that the Libyans were using aircraft. You know, the Russians themselves said we've got satellites and we didn't see them using any aircraft. But the China and Russia abstained on the Security Council resolution on the no-fly zone because they presumed it was going to be a humanitarian no-fly zone, pretty similar to the one in Bosnia, which was operational when I was an aid worker there. But of course they pretty quickly turned it into a carte blanche to bomb Gaddafi's forces from power and to bring the new regime to power in Libya, which is actually very friendly towards, you know, there's not even a regime, it's a sort of anarchic civil war in which various extreme Islamist factions are being able to function.
Well, what do you make of the timing, Martin? Similar to just before the Brexit vote. I mean, this does start to look a little bit like this Italian strategy of tension.
Well, it might do. I mean, whoever carried out the attack, quite clearly they did it with the election in mind. I mean, let's presume, if you presume it was just an Islamist attack with no implications for the security services, they obviously want to influence the election. They obviously want to create as much. The people doing this by killing prepubescent girls and so on want to create as much anger and tension as possible. And you know, the more division that they can create, the more success they will feel they've had. That goes for whoever's done it. And of course, it is an absolutely barbaric act which has no political justification in any way, shape or form. So there's no point discussing what may have caused it in terms of people being angry about other things. Nothing justifies it. But of course, it is true that continued NATO and bombing campaigns in the Middle East continually kill lots of civilians because they've got the bombs they use are very big and they're very destructive, and there's enormous civilian casualties, and there have been many civilian casualties every day of this war on terror. So we're in a very tricky situation now, and we've got to try and analyse every important aspect of this so that we can understand what may or may not be happening. And as I say, the Libyan connection is the one that I think needs to be most explored because, of course, MI5 and MI6 have had a long-standing relationship with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group were oppositional to Gaddafi. They were aligned with Al-Qaeda. Many of their militants fought in Afghanistan. They were trained by Western Special Forces, and they operated from Britain with impunity because Britain was opposed to the Gaddafi regime. And, of course, also weaponry and personnel from Libya were being infiltrated into Syria in order to carry out the regime change there. So Abdul Hakim Belhaj, a Libyan Islamic Fighting Group militant, ends up in Syria running aspects of the Free Syrian Army. And, of course, many of the militants fighting inside Syria are not Syrian at all. So many of them are Libyans, some of them are Chechens. They're from all over. And, of course, they've been armed, trained and directed by the Saudi, the Qatari and the Western secret services, including the Turks. And, of course, in the Middle East itself, everybody's excruciatingly aware that these terrorist attacks are basically helped and supported by various outside forces. Whereas in the West, because they are relatively rare, people are shocked when they take place and they think that each one of these is a singular event. Whereas in actual fact, of course, they're a part of a pattern of destabilisation, which is to do with the geopolitical struggles in the Middle East, over oil, over resources, to prevent, for example, Russia and China from improving their position in the Middle East. That's what it's really about. So it's not so much we get the oil or the resources, we prevent other people from having it by creating chaos. So Roland Dumas, the former French foreign minister, he was interviewed on French TV some years ago now, 2 years ago now, and he said, but before the Arab Spring, before anything kicked off in Syria or Libya, he was approached by British officials who said to him, we are going to run an armed uprising in Syria. So we've got prima facie evidence that the British intelligence services in particular were involved in the creation of an armed struggle in Syria, the arming and training of foreign jihadis to fight there, including from Libya, and now one of these jihadis has now turned around and apparently carried out an evil act inside Britain. So that's a tour de horizon as far as I can give one.
Now, I was hoping to be joined by Amandla Thomas-Johnson. Amandla, are you there?
Hi, how are you, Tony?
This article that you've done just yesterday for Middle East Eye, I think was fascinating. It's showing that there are actually quite close connections between Libya and Manchester.
Yeah. I mean, really, what my article wanted to, try to show was British policy in Libya and parts of the Middle East has sort of been inconsistent over the years. We had a time where, Gaddafi was enemy number one. The former Libyan dictator was enemy number one. Then he came back in from the cold in the infamous deal in the desert, and then he was effectively overthrowing people with air support from Britain and other countries. And as you know today, Jeremy Corbyn has spoken about the role of foreign policy in all of this. I think really what's important is that it's not really pinpointing Libya's foreign policy, but rather Britain's foreign policy in the whole Muslim world as being a driving factor for terrorism.
That's amazing and rather worrying. I mean, also, apparently, the MI5 used to sort these people's travel out. And, I mean, at the top of the hour, I said, well, if you're reporting potential terrorists to MI5, they actually may be seen by them as a kind of recruiting tool. Do you think that's stretching a point?
I don't really know about that, to be honest. I mean, what I would say is the fact that much of this was hidden from us, sort of citizens, and I think it's important for us to uncover this a bit more and talk about it a bit more, and that's the reason why I wrote the article, just to sort of put it out there and to sort of show that what we see as ordinary citizens isn't always what actually takes place.
Now, from your contacts, you've garnered that the security services have been helping these people with not only with travel once they've recruited them, but also elite SAS training. I mean, I just wondered. Have you got actually any evidence, or is this just hearsay from your contacts?
I mean, I should make it clear that there's no. I haven't put in my article that the security services are recruiting people. I think that's an exaggeration of really what's going on. The security services turned a blind eye to people who went over to Libya, but they were not actually recruiting people per se. In terms of, and it's important to obviously understand that what happened in Manchester, we're not 100% sure that this guy fought in Libya. We don't know the connection between him and what took place in Libya. people who fought there have come back. They've settled into their normal, ways of life, and they haven't really given problems to British society. So it's important to point out, in actual fact, that many people who fought there saw what they were doing as a fight for freedom, and not terrorism.
One of the things which I found really striking about the online article, was that there was a Tripoli mural commemorating the Manchester fighters who joined the 17th of February Martyrs Brigade against Gaddafi. It's actually quite a striking mural with the kind of Islamic flags, Islamist flags. What do you think inspired people to go over there?
Gaddafi. When you look at the level of oppression we have in 1996, 1,000 people killed over the space of 2 days, prisoners actually, in a mass slaughter. We have numerous public executions. We have a very oppressive regime that literally turns the country into a security state. We have the rounding and disappearing of ordinary civilians, of politicians, of doctors, of people from all walks of life. That's what got them to rise up. And I haven't lived under those circumstances, but I'm sure that if I did, then would I be driven to do something? Who knows?
You're talking also about this going on back in 2011. Old Seymour Hersh would only have been about 16 years old. But look, as any journalists, we all try and get both sides of these stories. So, have you managed to get any kind of attraction or comments or anything solid from the security services? Because they're a little bit difficult to track down. They didn't even have an official press office. Yeah,
of course. We sought comment from the Home Office, who said they can't comment on their policy to Libya. Security services just don't comment when it comes to the media. So, no, we haven't got a comment from them.
Well, I think you'll find that Andrew Parker has been commenting to a certain extent today. But look, as someone that's had a really good look at this, Amandla, what do you think that should be informing us as public, as journalists and as politicians on where policy should be going?
I think that when something like this happens, it's important to step back and try and look at the entire sort of scene. What tends to happen with these things is there's there are knee-jerk reactions. There's the promise of resources for, further terrorism policies and policing and all those sort of things. But we need to look at whether they're actually working. What people in the Muslim community, tell me is that actually the government needs to engage more with the Muslim communities in this country. We have the Muslim Council of Britain, who the government refuses to speak to. We have other organisations, who are just considered beyond the pale of sort of, talking about issues within this country. And so unless that discussion takes place, then we're going to have further problems.
OK, so that's Amandla Thomas-Johnson from London-based Middle East Eye website. Thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.
Thank you very much. OK, bye-bye.
Martin Summers, glad we managed to finally get Amandla there, but this whole connection between the Manchester attack and Libya has really been thrown into stark focus because of the revelation by the United States that Salman Abedi's father was actually a Libyan intelligence officer and had been working very closely with MI6 for many years, including the 1990s, the noughties, right up to the time of the civil war in Libya.
Well, if you remember David Shaler and Annie Machon, when they whistle blew what was happening in MI5, what tipped them over the edge was the fact that the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group were being given resources by MI6 for an assassination attempt on Gaddafi, which then took place. They didn't manage to kill Gaddafi, but they managed to kill various civilians who were around Gaddafi. And at that point, that's when they blew the whistle. So in other words, and don't forget that going back to the 1980s, jihadis from all over the world were funnelled into Pakistan and then into Afghanistan to fight against the Russian army or the Soviet army, and at that stage there was an intimate relationship between the so-called Safari Club of Western intelligence services and these Islamist groups, including specifically the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is particularly strong in the Benghazi region of Libya. And the Libyans, in fact, were per head the people who most fought in Afghanistan and elsewhere. and that Gaddafi always saw them as a threat. And of course, he said during the fighting to remove him, you will regret this because Islamists will take over here and then they will come to attack you. So Gaddafi has been proved right about that. I think there are all when we go on about the Gaddafi regime being a repressive regime, as was just being mentioned earlier. Well, the Saudi regime's a pretty repressive regime, and they're killing potentially hundreds of thousands of Yemenis as we speak. But far from trying to stop them, we're selling them weapons and giving them every encouragement. So I don't think it's anything to do with human rights when the West intervenes in this region. It's entirely realpolitik from start to finish.
Going back to the fact that Muslims in Manchester did report several times this guy to the anti-terror hotline, it does remind me of back at the time of 7/7, a couple of years before that happened, someone called Martin Gilbertson, who was a IT I'm going to say guru, but he was an IT helper at the Iqra bookshop, amongst other things. He actually reported the Martin McDade, who was a former SBS soldier who was training Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shazad Tanweer in terrorist activity over in, I think it was in Wales, maybe. But these people were reported, particularly Martin McDade was reported again in the 7/7 attacks. Someone phones the anti-terror hotline and said, look, you've got to keep an eye on this guy. There's a potential future problem brewing up here. And what happens is they're just allowed to travel freely, in this case, backwards and forwards to Libya whenever he wanted to.
Well, that's because the suspicion is that the intelligence services, or elements within the intelligence services, are complicit in Islamist terrorism, because they have been. They certainly were in the 1980s. The Syrian government believes that they are. As I mentioned, Roland Dumas earlier, the former French foreign minister, said he was approached saying that we're going to have an armed uprising in Syria. And of course, they rely upon these Islamist groups to destabilise regimes they don't like. And they also rely on them as being a reliable bogeyman, that they can say, we're going to have to intervene in Syria to stop ISIS. Yeah. Well, the way to stop ISIS in Syria is to support the Syrian government, their Russian and Iranian allies, to crush ISIS.
We're looking at the comparisons between this attack and this Islamist domestic terror threat here in Britain and Operation Gladio, the strategy of tension in Italy. But what about the IRA bombing campaign in London? I think there are some interesting contrasts there as well, because I mean, I know for a fact, talking to journalists that were covering it at the time, the IRA would wave at the CCTV cameras when they were planting the bombs. Certainly the Canary Wharf bomb, as they were planting it, they wave at it. It looked almost as if MI5, I'm not saying they wanted it to happen, but they certainly weren't intervening. And there is a spin-off, isn't there, for the security services in actually having these bomb attacks. It's a horrible thing to say, but I think we need to have evidence that they are actually actively stopping them. And certainly when they're being told the details about this bomber being dangerous, and then they're just simply not acting. They're saying, well, sorry, we can't tell you anything. It's all covered by national security.
Well, what I would suggest to people, and I made this point at Birmingham Central Mosque some years ago, is if you suspect that somebody is a terrorist or has got terrorist sympathies, you shouldn't phone the anti-terrorist hotline. You should speak to the local police.
Go and talk to your local beat manager.
Go and talk to your local police officers, because they are the least likely to use the intelligence in a manipulative way. I mean, the Donald McIntyre did a very good panorama documentary about what went on in Northern Ireland, which was shown a couple of years ago on BBC One, and it was pretty clear that they'd infiltrated and directed the Loyalist terrorist campaign, and that involved killing hundreds of people, and the British Army knew everything about it. They were directing it.
Now, we heard on Wednesday that the Manchester bomber was known, inverted commas, up to a point by security services. The Home Secretary Amber Rudd has confirmed. So that up to a point, I mean, surely if they're in constant contact and regular contact, and his father is one of the MI6's main agents around the world, surely they would have known more than up to a point.
Well, yeah, well, if you look at the previous attacks that have taken place in France and elsewhere, it turns out that many of the principals involved had long-standing relations with the security services. I mean, of course, the security services justify this. Well, we've got to infiltrate these groups, and that involves turning various members and so on. But I mean, the guy who drove the truck into the Christmas market, I was reading that the evidence has come out that he was actually a full-time informant for the security services. Now, because of Operation Gladio, many people in Britain are totally unaware of this, but it's been proven by lots of police investigation. The head of the Italian Supreme Court in Posimato has written a book about it. It's known beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt that the intelligence services were directly funding and directing terrorist attacks in Italy during that period, and they were basically directing all kinds of terrorism. The same sort of thing happens in Turkey. Top NATO generals in Turkey were sent to prison for being part of the so-called Ergonokon network, which was doing exactly the same thing, planting bombs, assassinating people, trying to kill people at random in order to try and control the political outcomes in the society. And I'm afraid this is NATO standard operating procedure. Now, if like in Turkey, people have been put on trial, we might be prepared to trust the intelligence services. But since nobody's been punished, we've got to presume the same tactics are still operational.
Martin, also on Wednesday, the Ron Paul Institute published an article. He was a former Republican presidential candidate in the United States. Manchester bomber was a product of the West's Libya, Syria intervention, and it does seem as if there's something very, very close here between those two. That's can you just explain why it is that Libya plays such an important role in all this?
Well, don't forget that the Libyan regime was overthrown in a fairly bloody fashion. It certainly wasn't a pushover. Gaddafi's troops fought quite hard, but of course they didn't have air superiority, and eventually they were crushed. And as soon as that happened, the Americans and the British set up a rat line. There's a brilliant article about this in the London Review of Books by Seymour Hersh, the red lines and the rat lines. They set up a rat line from Libya to supply both weaponry from the extensive arsenals that were available there, including sort of anti-tank weaponry and so forth, and personnel, and like Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who ended up being a Free Syrian Army leader, but of course he was a Libyan, and the Libyans were well trained, well armed, and they were infiltrated into Syria to try and overthrow the Assad regime, which turned out to have a much stronger base than the Gaddafi regime, which is why it's still in power now.
Let's not beat about the bush. Is it feasible that there was some elements deliberately involved in this attack in Manchester to affect the climate before the general election? I mean, this does seem... I mean, because, look, let's just compare it to various other attacks like the Joe Cox attack that happened a similar period of time before the Brexit vote.
Well, it may not be so much to affect the election. It may have a longer-term goal, which is that NATO wants to go to war with Syria. And if Theresa May can be cemented in power with a mandate, inverted commas, to go to war with Syria, even though she won't win 50% of the vote, I'm pretty confident of that. The purpose of all of these attacks is to create a siege mentality so that the state can then justify... I mean, but many mainstream politicians in this country voted in favour or supported the idea of bombing the Syrian military after the so-called chemical weapons attack at Idlib, which, of course, the Russians are now saying, well, they've analysed the videos, and there wasn't actually any kind of an attack at all. It was just a staged event. Now, this is the sort of thing that's going on. Is it possible that the deep state could be involved? It's very possible. But on the other hand, were they involved? I think we've got to suspend judgment. It's quite possible that individuals, for all kinds of psychological and political reasons, might decide to do something as awful as this. But on the other hand, it's unlikely. It's more likely that there is a political depth to this.
There a certain total invulnerability for the people at MI5? Amandla Thomas-Johnson was just saying, he's asking them for a comment. They just don't want to know.
Well, the problem is that they've got a track record of being involved in this kind of stuff in the past. When we're talking about Operation Gladio, I mean, obviously the lead agencies were mostly the Italian secret services, CISMI and so on, but the chief of these networks is basically the Brits and the Americans. We are the ones that pull all the strings in NATO. So if NATO's a terrorist organisation, which it is, there's no disputing that, then they've still got that mentality today, haven't they?
A couple of other things, Martin. Suicide bombings, well... They don't really need to be a suicide bombing against a soft target. It could be in a backpack, could be left. It could be even a concealed device in a backpack. It could be remotely controlled in someone else's backpack from nearby. And also, there are also reports of multiple bangs. Lots of people, in fact, I've done a little compilation, I'll put a link to it on our show page, of many people talking of more than one bang. Certainly one of them saying it sounded like gunfire.
Yeah, well, I mean, we saw that in France as well with the Charlie Hebdo attacks. There was far too many people killed in far too many locations to be carried out by the people that they claimed had done it. The FBI in the US, there's a recent study come out by lawyers showing that 95% of all those convicted of terrorism offences in the US, the terrorism offences were all basically plots concocted by the FBI. And the other 5% are all successful attacks that took place, and then whoever carries them out ends up dead. Now, the way I think this works is that you have got a substratum of radicalised semi-Muslim youth. They don't often, many of them are converts to Islam and so on. They're not actually original Muslims, many of them, but they've had trouble with the law. They've got drug, drink, alcohol, personality problems. These are the kind of flotsam and jetsam which can be manipulated to do evil things by whoever is manipulating. Now, ISIS, of course, the Syrian general staff, the Iranian general staff, the Iraqi general staff are all pretty much, and the Chinese general staff are all pretty much convinced that they are being supported and directed from inside NATO and by the Saudi Arabians. They may be wrong about that, but that's what their intelligence tells them. And that includes the democratic government of Iraq, which we went to war to impose on them. They've got one now, and of course it's dominated by Shia, who are very, very suspicious of the motives of the NATO intelligence services.
Now, I noticed Salman Abedi's father, Ramadan Abedi, over in Libya, gave a few press interviews. He started to get lots and lots of press interviews, then suddenly he's arrested.
Yes, he's arrested by the authorities, whoever they may be. It's basically, he's been taken away by armed men. Now, it may be the case that all the arrests that have taken place in Britain are arresting people who know too much about what's happened, and therefore they need to be taken out of circulation. But let's suspend judgment. The Manchester police may be doing an honourable job here of rolling up this network, because it clearly is a network behind this attack. The question then becomes is, why is this network being tolerated? And it's not because of Morrissey said at a gig the other day, because there's too many immigrants in Britain. It's because since the early 1980s, Britain has been a home for extremist jihadis, because we set up the Islamic International Brigade that ultimately became Al-Qaeda. And Britain was the lead agency, MI6 was the lead agency in Operation Cyclone, the biggest so-called covert programme in history, and because of the empire and the knowledge and skill that the British intelligence services had at manipulating Muslims and Muslim opinion. You remember Lawrence of Arabia? That was us. And of course, that's why all these Abu Hamza, if you remember him, it the pantomime villain of The Sun and all the rest of it, turns out that he was working for MI5 all along. And of course, all of these rather unpleasant jihadis that are operating in Britain in various communities have been tolerated for years, because Britain has been a major player in setting up these jihadi networks in the first place. The story is that we set all these jihadi networks up, but then we lost control of them. So I think the minimum we can say about this attack is its blowback for all the meddling that we've engaged in over the years. But I'd probably go further than that. It isn't just blowback. There are two ways in which the security services can manipulate things. We call them MI-HOP and LI-HOP. Made it happen on purpose or let it happen on purpose. I think in this case we're possibly looking at LI-HOP rather than MI-HOP, but it's hard to say. And I think people need to start thinking about this, because the idea that the security services are in fact not against terrorism, but use it as a tool of their trade is a straightforward one, and I'm afraid, given the evidence of decades, it's pretty clear it's probably true. And that's why we've got to rely upon the civilian police force. Greater Manchester Police have got to show independence of spirit and recognise that if the inquiry leads in the direction that these people have been basically given a nod and a wink by the security services, they've got to pursue that.
Well, it's easy to say, Martin. It's not so easy for Manchester Police to go down to London, get into MI5 and force people to actually potentially arrest an intelligence officer.
Well, it may well be that the leaders in the police force are in fact complicit. So we can't presume that they're not biddable to this kind of programme.
I mean, we saw this, for example, in the paedophile scandal, didn't we? Police, as they start getting close to a powerful paedophile, they're lent on by their bosses. They're told, sorry, that someone else is taking over this case.
I think what everybody's got to accept is when people like us say that the intelligence services may have allowed this to happen, or worse still, may have made it happen, that is not a crazy idea. It isn't a crazy idea. It's a perfectly straightforward idea. It might not be true. That's what the investigation is generally determined to find out. But in Turkey, for example, the breakdown of the ceasefire between the PKK and the government, which had been in place for quite a while, some years, was when the ISIS attacked a Kurdish rally and killed loads of people. And immediately the Kurds drew the conclusion that ISIS had carried out the attack, but that meant that was the Turkish government, and the ceasefire ended, and they started fighting again after several years of having negotiations. And that's because everybody in Turkey knows very well that the extreme Islamists of ISIS are directly puppeted by the Turkish intelligence services MIT, and everybody, the dogs in the street, know it, and MIT are our allies. And, of course, it may be, you see, that other intelligence services have carried out this attack on Britain in order to push us in a certain kind of direction. The Israelis spring to mind. They want us to have a conflictual relationship with the Muslim world. So it's in their interest for such a thing like this to happen. And, of course, after the Charlie Hebdo attack, Erdogan said, the president of Turkey, that he suspected that the Israelis had had some hand in the attack. Now, he's an elected guy. It doesn't mean he knows anything. But, of course, in Turkey, everybody, whatever side of the political spectrum they're on, they know that the intelligence services, the NATO intelligence services, are terrorists.
Getting bigger by being better. The #1 choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.